Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our talk. Today we'll be speaking about the 10 things you know to know before you work your next BEC. My name's Ida.
My name's Natasha, and we both work at Strauss Friedberg, an Aon company, in our digital forensics and incident response team. We do a lot of different kinds of cybersecurity incidents. We respond to a lot of different types of cases. That includes business email compromise cases, which is what we're going to be talking to you all about today. I'm a consultant in our DFIR practice, and a fun fact about me is that I recently moved back to the New Jersey, New York area after being in DC for the last 10 years.
My name's Ida, and I've been with Strauss Friedberg for a little over 4 years. I'm a senior consultant, also based out of the New York office. And a fun fact about me, photography is my passion. So for today's talk, we will first go over the basics of M365 BECs, and then we'll move on to the 10 things to know before you work your next BEC. And we'll conclude our talk with speaking about how to support organizations that are dealing with BECs. This will not be a full forensic analysis of a BEC. This will just be the low-hanging fruit and what analysts should look for, some quick wins, what analysts should look for when conducting BEC investigations.
Great. So before we go into the 10 things you should know about before you work your first BEC, we want to just go through some basics and make sure everyone's on the same wavelength when we're actually going through our 10 tips and tricks. So first, what is a business email compromise, or a BEC? It's a type of cyber attack where threat actors try and infiltrate an email environment. In our case specifically, we look at M365 email environments in order to cause some sort of disruption or harm to the organization. So there are a couple of different ways business email compromise cases can happen in reality. I think a lot of us probably think about phishing attempts. There's a lot of social engineering attempts or impersonation attempts that happen where threat actors send out emails and they just trick users into clicking in an email. However, as often as that happens, we also equally see as many cases starting where organizations just aren't implementing strong MFA methods. So when we're talking about stronger MFA methods, we're talking about things like FIDO2 authentication or token-based or code-based authentication methods, things that really are just more difficult to break into by a threat actor. Additionally, there are other ways, such as brute forcing. We don't see that as often, but we definitely have seen that in the past, so that is another way that they can happen. So then there are a couple of implications, especially for organizations that might be going through a BEC. I think one of the biggest ones we see through our casework is that there's financial loss that can happen. A lot of the phishing attempts that we see try and trick users into sending some sort of wire fraud, and so that they can lose up to like thousands and thousands of dollars for their organization. So that's definitely one that we see pretty often. We also see data theft or information harvesting happening as well. So with that, they can get access to SharePoint files or Outlook mail items, even user data or contacts. There are a lot of things in M365 that are available for users to get access to, but also for threat actors to get access to as well. So with that information, there's a lot of things they can also do. They might be able to harvest credentials. They might be trying to steal company data. There's a lot of things that organizations keep in their M365 environment. Additionally, there could be reputational damage as well. There's a lot of personal identifiable information or personal health information that organizations keep in their M365 environment, and with a BEC, a lot of that is at risk. So when we are talking to our clients, we also want to make sure that their legal counsel is aware of what's going on as well. In case there are any notifications that need to go out to their customers as well, we try and get as comprehensive of an overview as we can to our clients. Additionally, we don't see this as often, but we can see BECs being a way for threat actors to gain a foothold in a networked organization. I actually, just this week, scoped a case where the user, as part of a phishing attempt, downloaded some sort of PDF that we're still trying to figure out what was going on with it. I have a feeling it might be malicious considering the threat actor sent it out. So it is. There are things like that where we might see threat actors trying to break into the organization a little bit more.
Thanks so much, Natasha. Now let's go over the M365 log sources. These are the logs that you'll be using to perform your analysis. This is where you're going to be pulling the data from. So first and foremost, we've got the Unified Audit Log. This is probably the greatest log in terms of depth as well as breadth This is the log that you will mainly be using for your analysis. And this log contains any user, group, application, domain, and directory activities that are performed in the client. So for example, SharePoint, OneDrive access, user logins that were successful, as well as user logins that were failed. These would all be in the unified audit log. Next, we've got the mailbox audit log, and this audit log contains any and all actions that are performed by mailbox owners, delegates, as well as admins. So for example, something that you would see in this log would be a mail item being deleted, a mail item being updated, or mail items even being sent out. And this is crucial when we're looking for threat actor activity. How do we know what a threat actor sent out, and how do we know what a threat actor may have deleted to hide their tracks? Next, we've got the Azure AD sign-in log. And essentially, Microsoft Entra, they log all sign-ins into the tenant, and this will also include logins and any activity about your internal apps as well as resources. So for example, if we've got an OAuth application, we are able to see activity that is performed and logons that are coming in from that OAuth application. Next, the Azure audit log. And this contains all information about changes that are applied within your tenant. So for example, user and group management, as well as any updates that are applied to your tenant's resources. And last but not least, we've got the message trace log. And this trace log shows if an email was received, whether it was rejected or deferred or delivered. It can also show the actions that were taken between the time that the message was sent and by the time the message that was delivered to the recipient. So for example, we will use this very often to understand what messages were accessed by the threat actor as well as sent out as well. Here we've got the M365 resources as well as portals. Feel free to take a picture of this slide. This will show all the documentation about all the log sources and all the slides. They can be pulled through the portals as well as through specific PowerShell commands that are also available in the documentation. So feel free to take pictures.
We'll wait for a second if you want to take a picture. Okay, I think everyone is set. Okay,
Yep,
great. So before we, again, dive a little bit deeper into the 10 things you should know about, we do want to discuss some limitations that can occur while you're doing a business email compromise case. First, we often see sometimes that the unified audit log just isn't enabled in the environment. So there are a couple of reasons why this could happen. I think the first one just being that Microsoft currently now has the UAL enabled for organizations that are looking to move into M365. However, organizations that have historically been part of M365 don't necessarily have that enabled. So definitely if you are an admin in your M365 portal, definitely make sure you're going in and checking to make sure that the UAL is enabled in your environment. As Ida mentioned earlier, the UAL is an incredibly powerful source when you're doing M365 investigations. It tracks SharePoint files, mail access, tracks when you're logging in, or if MFA devices are being added, things that would be very crucial to your M365 investigation. Next, there could be some log licensing limitations. So typically when we're talking about M365, there are a couple of different tiers. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm sure that could be a whole separate presentation in and of itself. But for example, a lot of organizations will typically have like an E3 license or an E5 license. So with E3 license, you're looking at having about 180 days worth of logging in your unified audit log, your UAL, versus with your E5 licensing, you have 365 days. So with that, there are business considerations. As security professionals, I'm sure we would love to have as much information as we can with the logs. But when it comes to a business standpoint, you have to understand that organizations have to do, what makes sense for their business and what's in their budget for their M365 environment. Additionally, another thing that's good to know is that there are Azure sign-ins that kind of track more of identity and access management and tracks how you're signing in with MFA. So that's also equally, I think, as important of a log source. And Microsoft has specific licensing for that. You can get a standard license that has 7 days of licensing, I believe, versus a premium license like P1 or P2, which would hold 30 days of logging. So again, it's really important to consider those as you're making security decisions. Definitely, as security professionals, I'm sure, again, we all know that we want to have as much as we can, but You get it. Next is delays in compromise identification. So, sometimes organizations might not even know that they're going through a business email compromise, or they might be identify the compromise a little bit too late. One example I can think of is if we get hired to do a threat hunt in someone's environment and we see some suspicious, maybe malicious activity going on, maybe like 220 days into the logging. With E5 licensing, we would still be able to investigate that further to see, was there any data taken? Was there any mail access that was accessed? Things like that. Versus if you have E3 licensing, you might not have that as much. Finally, we do want to talk about intermittent Microsoft IP addresses showing up in the logs. It's a little bit frustrating. I don't think anyone on our team has fully understood the full scope of why this happens, but we see this a lot happening when we're doing analysis looking at SharePoint files or mail access items, where we see residential IP addresses or like the user's organization's IP addresses, and then randomly we'll start seeing Microsoft IP addresses, which typically on a normal basis wouldn't be that big of a deal. However, when you're talking about a compromise, you're trying to differentiate what's threat actor activity versus what is normal user activity. So with that, it becomes a little bit more challenging. What we typically do during our investigations is compile a list of for our client that here's a list of known malicious SharePoint files that were accessed or mail that was accessed. Here's a list of we don't tell them that it's Microsoft IP addresses, but we give them a list of files that we believe were accessed during the threat actor window that we can attribute to either the user or the threat actor. And so that way they have as much of an overview as to what could have been accessed. With that, they can go back to the users and ask them if they remember what exactly they were clicking on. But I'm sure as you can remember, or you can understand, if you're having an investigation that happened maybe like 3 weeks ago, each user is not going to remember exactly what they clicked on every single thing. So typically you would want to keep that fully in scope when you're trying to create legal notices for that. So with that, we're now going to start going into our 10 things that you should know before you work your next BEC. But before that, it looks like XQP Incorporated they identified some suspicious activity. So it looks like they identified some weird activity coming from their testing team's email account, test@test.onmicrosoft.com. And they identified some anomalous activity starting on September 17th, 2024. Now, they're a small organization. They're based out of the Fort Worth, Texas area, and they really only expect to see activity coming from there. They also mentioned that they only use Apple devices in their environment. So Ida, do you want to maybe start going through, how we would start doing this investigation?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much, Natasha. So right off the bat, we're going to want to identify some quick wins. These are, again, low-hanging fruit, what you should look for when you first begin an incident, to gather as many IOCs as you can and begin timelining. So to begin, we are going to look at the Unified Audit Log. We're really going to look at all the logs, but we're going to start with the Unified Audit Log as well as the Azure AD sign-in log and look for any suspicious sign-ins. We're going to start with looking for commonly known hosting providers. So on the screen here, we've got just a short list. These are not the end-all be-all. There are, of course, more hosting providers, more VPN ISPs that threat actors like to leverage. These are just some of the ones that we see very often in the wild. And again, just because we see a VPN logon, a hosting provider logon, that does not necessarily mean that it's a malicious logon. We always have to verify with the client as well as with a specific user what they were using to sign in, what IP addresses they think they were using to sign in, if they know, and what hosting providers, what ISPs. And if you look at the screen here, we only see the user ID, the creation time, that's the time that the event logged on, so the time that the user logged in event happened, as well as the IP address. And just from the IP addresses, we can't tell everything. We can only tell the operation, the user ID, and the creation time. However, with a little bit of IP enrichment, we are able to now identify the country, the city, as well as the ISP. And now it's a little bit more obvious what is potentially anomalous and what is definitely legitimate. So based on our conversations with the client, we know that the user logged in from the United States. We also spoke with the user, and they informed us that they did not travel to France, and they usually do not use hosting providers as their ISPs. So we identify this activity as the first anomalous logon, and we're going to throw that in our timeline in our IOC list.
I think one thing also to note about that as you're looking through this is especially with hosting providers like M247 or other ones that Ida mentioned earlier, just because you're seeing Paris, France in here, doesn't mean that the threat actor is based out of Paris, France. These kinds of techniques are used by threat actors to anonymize their activity as well. So it's important to note that, regular users also, I don't see it that often, but they definitely can be using things like this as well. So it's definitely important to have a conversation, as Ida mentioned, with the client to make sure that they aren't using hosting providers or VPNs like this.
Next, let's look at all the inbox rules that are available. So an inbox rule is a rule that is placed by the user or potentially a threat actor within the mailbox that will allow emails with a certain subject or a certain sender to be sent or forwarded to either another folder, or if it's a forwarding rule, a potentially external, potentially personal email address. So how do we know what inbox rules are suspicious and what inbox rules are legitimate? So of course, we're gonna wanna verify with the user, but usually patterns that we see in the wild are randomly named inbox rules. So for example, 1234 or FF or any combination of random characters and or numbers, and specifically a combination of 3 or 4 periods. We see that very common in the wild. Next, what folder are these mail items being moved to? Are they being moved to the RSS folders or the conversation history? These folders are not typical folders that the user would open or browse to, let alone send their mail to. So again, this is very suspicious. And threat actors will do this to hide their tracks. The likelihood of the user opening up a threat actor sent email, if the threat actor and user are logged in at the same time, the likelihood of the user discovering that mail is very low if the mail item is in a folder that the user does not browse to. And next, we're going to compare that with IOCs that we already have. So for example, is the rule enabled within the threat actor time frame, or was the rule created from the same IP or a similar IP or even ISP that we see a malicious logon coming in from, for example? So back to our client, our test user, we are seeing that there is a new inbox rule. We are seeing that it is created during the time that the threat actor has already logged in, so it's after the very first logon. And we see that the description of the rule is if the message contains the words payment overdue, we're gonna take the following actions. We're gonna move the mail to the RSS feeds, and we're gonna stop processing the rule. We also know that the rule is currently enabled because the enabled column is true, and we also see that the ISP is consistent with the original malicious logon.
Great. So the next thing we're going to want to do after we get our quick wins is start timelining and maintaining an indicators of compromise or an IOC list immediately. Now, I know a lot of us are blue teamers in here, and a lot of us know what the importance of timelining is, but I really wanted to highlight it specifically in context of a BEC. I think sometimes people think that BECs can be a little bit less complicated than ransomwares, and that can definitely be true. But there are definitely more complex M365 investigations that you might be doing. For example, like when I first started working business email compromise cases, I was definitely starting off with some of the easier ones. There were probably only 1 or 2 compromised users. However, as I advanced a little bit more into working more complex investigations, I once had a case where I think I ended up identifying like 9 compromised users probably, and I wasn't fully keeping track of all of them because in my head in the past, when there was only 1 or 2 users, it was fairly easy for me to keep track. However, as you have more compromised users, it's definitely more complicated to keep track of everything as you're going. So we really wanted to highlight it's important as soon as you can to just start timelining all of your activity. There are 3 critical dates, I would say, that are important in an M365 investigation. Of course, as you can imagine, your first malicious activity and your last malicious activity is going to be critical when you're doing your M365 investigations. That's a really great way to bookmark your investigations, especially tying it back to when I was talking about the intermittent Microsoft IP addresses. You want to make sure you're getting a full list of data that could have been accessed during the threat actor window, and you want to make sure you're not giving your client information that's outside of scope. You want to make sure you're giving them an accurate picture as to what was going on during the investigation. Finally, the third date that is really important is going to be your password reset date. That's a good way to generally get an idea that the threat actor is mostly kicked out of the environment. There are a couple of exceptions. One thing we're going to talk about in a little bit is threat actors adding malicious OAuth applications. That's one example where even if you change the password, the threat actor still might have access to the environment. So password change alone isn't enough, but it's a really good step in making sure that the threat actor is starting to get kicked out, if not fully kicked out of the environment. Finally, again, as I mentioned, you're going to want to start maintaining an indicators of compromise list. That can include things such as like an IP address, internet service provider, location, malicious domain, anything that you can think of, user agents, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Really easy ways where we can go into other log sources. As Ida mentioned, there are a lot of log sources that we need to look through during an M365 investigation. And we want to make sure that we're trying to find activity as quickly as possible while we're doing our investigations.
Next, we've got tracking MFA devices that a threat actor may have added. So it's very common for threat actors to add their own MFA devices in order to essentially gain footholds into the environment and create a persistence mechanism. When a threat actor, for example, bypasses MFA, they will need to approve an MFA request later on, whether that's for potential exfiltration or mailbox syncing. So instead of sending an MFA code that the user may or may not accept, knowingly or unknowingly, of course, the threat actor will have already gained that foothold and will already have had that MFA device that they can now use and accept at any time and as often as they need to. That's why it's very important to timeline, as Natasha mentioned, it's very important to timeline when we see an MFA device being added, whether or not that's in the threat actor time window, and also whether or not that is before or after the first malicious logon. If we see a malicious logon followed by an MFA device being added, that is very like the threat actor. In addition, when we are remediating, it's very important to remove any and all MFA devices that are not legitimately registered by the user, because again, even if the password is changed, even if the session is revoked, the threat actor may gain access to the password again. They may brute force, they may just simply guess it. And if MFA is enabled, but the threat actor has that MFA foothold, they will just be able to log in over and over again. So it's important to take this approach as holistic as possible and making sure you're checking all the right boxes and doing all the right remediation steps in order to keep the threat actor out.
Great. So as I alluded to earlier, one thing we're going to want to look out for are maliciously added OAuth applications. So before we even go into that, I just want to make sure that we all know what an OAuth application is. It's an application that can be used by to access some sort of third-party resource on behalf of a user using their M365 credentials. So we do see users using this a lot in a normal M365 environment. It definitely does not mean it's malicious. A lot of users use it, for example, to connect to some calendar or to some note app. There are definitely a lot of legitimate reasons why users connect to it. I'm sure a lot of us might even have those. However, because it's so common in an M365 environment, it's also a really easy way for threat actors to leverage it as well. So threat actors are able to leverage OAuth applications in a couple of different ways. First, they can do it in the middle of their attack, where they're trying to just install it and maintain access into the user's mailbox. Additionally, I personally haven't seen this. I've heard stories about this, though, where a threat actor will try and send out a phishing email that will allow users to enable the MFA or the OAuth application in order to start their attack. So that's really interesting. I kind of want to see how that plays out one day. I mean, not that I want anyone to have an BEC, but sure.
We'll keep an eye out when we're testing.
We'll keep an eye out. If anyone knows, let me know. But there are a couple of different ways that, or a couple of different things that can be accessed through a malicious OAuth application. I've done a little bit of testing. I still want to do a lot more testing when it comes to OAuth applications, but it's definitely something I'm personally very interested in. In certain applications, one that I've been testing recently is called EM Client. I've been able to see how threat actors can create or delete or access mail items, or create inbox rules, or add or view any delegate mailboxes, which we'll talk about delegate access in a little bit as well. Additionally, you can even view contacts or SharePoint files as well. So it basically almost acts like an actual M365 environment. Which is why it's really critical when you're doing your investigations to look out for these. Because as I mentioned earlier, especially if you're doing that password change, if you have a maliciously added OAuth application, having just changing the password itself is not going to be enough. You're going to want to make sure that that OAuth app is also removed from the environment. So Going back to our client, we were able to go into the Microsoft Defender portal, which is one of the log sources that we can look at for OAuth applications. And we were able to see actually that EM client was installed. It's a little bit blurry, but I promise you, it says September 17th, 2024, which is within our threat actor window as well. So with that, there are a couple of different ways we can go about accessing this a little bit more. You can go into the admin portal and see, what users what users have certain OAuth applications installed. With this, again, we already kind of know that we have a user in question, so we would definitely want to look at the user specifically and see whether or not they have EM Client installed in their application. Additionally, that information also might be in the unified audit log as well. You might see an app consenting. So that's also another way you can go about trying to identify that activity as well.
Next, we've got session IDs. Session IDs are important, they're crucial for our investigation, but relying on them alone is simply insufficient. Essentially, what a session ID is, it's a unique identifier that's assigned by M365 each time a new user creates a session. And it's very important to timeline sessions to understand what session threat actors are using. In addition, it's important to note that threat actors might have multiple session IDs, so using just a single session will be insufficient. You also need to make sure that you're going through all of your log sources and checking for all sessions that are present. So for example, if you see 3 malicious sessions in the unified audit log, you need to search for the same 3 malicious sessions in the mailbox audit log. And it's important to keep a working list of all your session IDs because there are cases when we may have 10, even 15 session IDs. So it would just be impossible to keep them all tracked in your head. Again, highlighting the importance of timelining. In addition, there are some events that do not have session IDs. So if you're only filtering by events that have session IDs, you will be missing crucial information. So again, reiterating the fact that it's important to take a holistic approach to the investigation and keep track of IOCs as well as timeline.
Great. So next we're going to talk about delegate access. So delegate access essentially allows one user to be able to view another user's mailbox. Now, again, like with a lot of things with M365 investigations, we do see users doing this fairly often. I can think of a couple of examples, I'm sure, where you have like a C-suite executive, for example, who just doesn't want to manage their M365 inbox, and they have someone else managing it for them. You would see that as a delegate access. Or, for example, if you work for an organization that really values your vacation time, that'd be awesome. Maybe your user might be adding a delegate access to another employee that is going to be working there while you are out on vacation. You don't even have to look at your mailbox, which would be awesome. So with that, though, threat actors also use delegate access while they're doing their attack. There's 2 different ways we typically will see this. One is just leveraging already existing delegate access that might happen, or that users might already have, or they might try and create their own to see whether or not they can access even more mailboxes during their attack. So with that, there are a couple of things to look out for, specifically in the unified audit log. You might see an add mailbox permission or a set mailbox permission in your logs. That's definitely something to look out for. Additionally, you should just be looking out for any users that have delegate access that shouldn't have it. One user shouldn't have delegate access to 7 different users. That, I'm sure in both of our opinions, is probably a little bit of overkill, and it definitely leaves you more susceptible to data loss when you're looking at an M365 investigation. So we have some mitigations that we recommend, or we tell our clients if we do see delegate access during their M365 attack. One of them is to revoke that delegate access immediately, especially if it was accessed by the threat actor. That's really critical to make sure that there's no way the threat actor can still access that account. And additionally, just again, as I mentioned earlier, manage the number of users that have delegate access per account. You don't need to have multiple people having it unless there is some legitimate business need. I'm sure maybe there is one that I can't think of, but try and limit it as much as possible. And then just audit your delegate access permissions. That's taking a little bit more of a proactive stance to it, but it's definitely good to make sure that as an M365 admin, you have full visibility into what's going on in your M365 environment, so that whether you're doing your own internal investigation or you're hiring someone like me and Ida, that you can give us as holistic as an overview as you can to help us go through the investigation as fast as we can. So again, looking back at our client's environment, it looks like we actually have 2 ad mailboxes or ad mailbox permission operations happening again within our threat actor window. So it's definitely important to note that we see it coming from our M247 internet service provider, which we now know, talking to the client, is definitely some threat actor activity. And we see 2 users that are being added to our test.onmicrosoft.com. So with that, we're going to want to look at the mailboxes of Jay Smith and Jay Doe during our investigation and see whether or not we can identify any additional malicious activity.
Next, it's important to keep track of user agents. A user agent can provide us information about the application, the operating system, the device, and the version number that the user is using to log in or perform any activity. So a typical user pattern would be, for example, a user logging in with Mozilla Firefox version 9, and then adding on to Mozilla Firefox 9.1, 9.2. So updating as the versions move forward. However, if a user legitimately logs in from, for example, a Mac, but then we are seeing Linux or even an Axios user agent, that would be highly suspicious, and we would have to investigate that further. Again, it's very important to timeline activity. If we see a user agent changing during the time of a threat actor, so right after that first logon or sometime during that threat actor window, it is potentially likely that that is a threat actor. That is one of the ways that we use to differentiate legitimate user activity versus anomalous user activities. It's also important to note that threat actors can spoof user agents. So take that with a grain of salt, but of course understanding that patterns are important and patterns are what will give you that insight into anomalous versus legitimate activity.
One point I also want to make with that is that is definitely possible, but we also use user agents for a very specific reason.
Yes.
We don't see that happening very often. It's just important to note that that can happen, if that makes sense.
So back to our test user, we again see a little bit more of a granular approach to this log. We not only now see that the country of logon is France, which we know is suspicious, not legitimate according to the user. We know that the city is Paris. We know that the ISP is M247, which is a hosting provider. Again, reiterating, threat actors will leverage specifically this hosting provider, among others, to perform their anomalous activity. But now we also see that the user agent is Windows, and after speaking with the user, we know that they informed us that they only have access to a Mac. So that, in conjunction with all the other IOCs and all the other patterns that we have, show us that this is very likely a threat actor logging into the environment.
Great. So next we wanted to talk to you all about legacy authentication. Legacy authentication essentially allows individuals to sign in with just a username and password. Now, this is now disabled by default, right? So why am I talking about this even though it's disabled? It still can be enabled in the environment. And it's something that we don't see very often, but we do still kind of see every now and then. And there are a couple of reasons why you might see it in an environment. One example I can think of is that if you just have older devices that might not be able to support MFA or other stronger authentication methods, or if you're using some kind of third-party application or something that might not allow authentication devices or things like that. There can be some business justifications. Well, we can discuss a little bit more about that in a minute, but we just wanted to point that out. However, there are a lot of implications, I'm sure, as you can imagine, when you only are signing in with just a username and a password. I think the biggest thing is that, again, it doesn't support multi-factor authentication, which is a big thing that we see when these business email compromise cases start. So we also see this being used to perform brute force attacks or password spray attempts. There are just like a lot of different ways that legacy authentication can be very problematic during an M365 investigation. So again, we talked about user agents on the last slide. There are a couple of user agents you can look out for. I only listed 3. I promise you there are a lot more. But we have a colleague that actually wrote a really great blog post on legacy authentication. So if you want to scan our QR code, promise it's not malicious. You can get a pretty good idea about what legacy authentication looks like in real time. So with that, there are a couple of mitigations. Number 1, let's just disable legacy authentication in your environment. You can do this using conditional access policies to make sure that that is complete. If you do legitimately need it, again, I mentioned a couple of different reasons why you might need it. M365, I think, has pretty good documentation on other options for you. that are just slightly even more secure than legacy authentication. Just anything that isn't just a username and a password would be really great when it comes to M365 investigations.
Search terms are important. They're often overlooked by analysts as well as users, but they are very crucial to our investigation. So just as we would search our mailbox in the little search bar above our mail, the threat actor can do the same. And they will essentially do this to perform reconnaissance. What can they find out about the organization? What data is present, potentially PII or PHI, even passwords that are stored in plain text? Threat actors can leverage that after they gain foothold and gain initial access into their mailbox. So it's very important for us to pull the search terms. However, there is one limitation. We, unfortunately, based on the logging, are not able to see the IP address of the user performing the search. However, what we will see is the date that the search was performed, the search term itself, of course, the user, and we will not be able to see the IP address. And the way that a user who is not themselves is able to see the search terms is by the use of delegate access. If someone has delegate access to someone else's account, they are able to see the search terms in the search term history. Again, since we don't know the IP address, it's important to verify with the user whether or not they perform the specific search that we're looking at to understand whether or not it's malicious or legitimate. Another important caveat is that threat actors, just as users, can delete search terms. So if you're seeing a blank search term history, that does not necessarily mean, although it can, that the search terms do not exist. The user or the threat actor could have just simply deleted them, so we won't be able to see them. So for our test user, for our user that is very highly likely at this point in time compromised, we see the search term history. We see that the date is within the time frame of the threat actor, and the search term is very similar to the subject of that original mail item in the inbox rule. So again, this is clearly the threat actor performing reconnaissance, trying to understand what are the contents of the mailbox that they are looking at.
Awesome. So the last thing we want to talk to you all today is to just keep up to date with Microsoft documentation. Now this seems kind of silly, right? We just spent a lot of time going through what actually you should be looking out for in M365 investigation. And now we're talking about documentation. It's kind of, boring a little bit. But Microsoft is constantly changing. Our friends over at Microsoft like to keep us on our toes, which is a lot of fun. We can commonly see things that we expect to see in one log source not be there in a couple weeks. So it's definitely important to make sure you're tracking that as you're doing your investigations to make sure you have as much visibility and information when you're solving these M365 cases. So we wanted to highlight a couple that we've recently been seeing happening, which are honestly, I think, kind of exciting.
Yeah.
First is the addition of the mail items access being available for more than just E5 licensing. So typically what that means is that when we used to do investigations for organizations that had E3 licensing, we would have to caveat all of our mail items access by giving them our list of known mail items that were accessed by the threat actors, mail items that could have been accessed, but we also would have to tell them this might not be a full encompassing analysis of what could have been viewed. And that's because we had Microsoft logging limitations. However, with this new addition, we actually now can say with confirmation what exactly was accessed or what was, exactly could have been accessed by the threat actor. We still have that Microsoft IP address. Anyone, if you're in Microsoft, we can talk. That'd be great. But additionally, there are a couple of things that are still kind of in the works, or we're starting to see being deprecated a little bit more now. First is the admin audit log being deprecated. So that would be tracking, all of your admin activity in your M365 environment. So now we're seeing that being moved more into the unified audit log, which is, again, great. We would love to look at only one log source and just have everything in there. So that's pretty exciting. Additionally, we're now seeing the mailbox audit log starting to, it's not officially deprecated yet. I think they're moving towards it being deprecated. However, we're seeing that information being moved into the unified audit log, which again is really exciting because we want to make sure we can get as much as we can into that unified audit log. So for example, we're looking at our unified audit log here for our test environment. And we see that we have a bunch of user logged in events. We know that we have our legitimate Lumen internet service provider, and then we have our M247. But then you can see that we also have a create and update operation. So within the unified audit log, if you do a little bit further analysis, you would see that the threat actor was trying to create and view emails that were related to that payment overview or overdue subject line, which again is what they created an inbox rule for, what they were searching for in the mailbox. So once you start getting that picture, you can really start tying the story together and try and figure out what the threat actor was doing during their attack. So with that, those are our 10 things to know. Just to quickly go over them again, you're going to want to look for quick wins while you're doing your analysis. You're going to want to timeline and maintain your IOC list as you're going through. You're going to want to track your MFA devices that could have been added during the time frame of compromise. You're not going to want to rely on your session IDs alone, but you're also going to want to make sure you're leveraging them as best as possible. You're going to want to pay attention to any delegate access that were either implemented by the user or by the threat actor. Either one is important. Keeping track of user agents is equally as important. Just being aware of legacy authentication, if you're seeing it in the environment, really important. Making sure if you can, get those search terms. See if you can get a better picture of what the threat actor was searching for. And finally, again, just keep up to date with Microsoft documentation. They're definitely going to be the best source of truth, even more than us right now, probably. So with that, did anyone remember the timeline?
That's all right, because we did. So let's timeline. Again, right off the bat, this is not by any means a full timeline. There will be hundreds, even sometimes thousands of events, depending on how many compromised users there are and how many IOCs we've got. So let's quickly go over our very high-level timeline. So to begin, on September 17th, we've got that first malicious logon. We have confirmed it's malicious based on all the criteria. We know that it's coming from M247, which is a hosting provider. Again, reiterating, this is very likely, very commonly what threat actors will use. However, it does not always mean that it's malicious. Next, we are seeing 2 add mailbox permission. We are seeing JSmith and JDoe that were added as delegate by the test user. We also see that that activity is coming from our hosting provider, from our malicious ISP, again, confirming that this is malicious. We are then seeing the new inbox rule being created, and the mail item for that, the subject, is payment overdue. Next, we're seeing the threat actor creating a mail item with the subject payment overdue, again relating to their reconnaissance. And the threat actor will start interacting with mail items that are again related to that payment overdue subject. We also know that this is very important to note that this is our last known activity coming from the malicious IP. And the very next event shows that the password is being reset. This shows that the threat actor has been removed from the environment. We also spoke with the client. We understood that they have revoked sessions, removed any malicious OAuth apps, any MFA devices that were added by the threat actor, as well as a forced password reset, confirming MFA is enabled, and revoking all session tokens and cookies for that session. So now we can confirm that the threat actor has been removed from the environment.
So long as they remove DM client from the environment.
Yes.
Just want to point that out as well. Another thing I want to point out, this was a simulation for this presentation for legal reasons. This is not an actual client data. Awesome. So finally, we want to talk to you all about how you can either support an organization if you're like Ida and me and working on helping organizations get through a BC, or if you're working on your own internal investigation. Equally as important to understand how you can support yourself going through that investigation as well. So in terms of containment, if you're going through an active incident, again, as I mentioned probably 15 times during this presentation, you're going to want to make sure that your passwords, especially for your compromised users, are changed immediately as soon as you can, and ensure that all those sessions are revoked as well. Additionally, you're going to want to review and remove anything that was added by the threat actor during your incident. So that can include anything like inbox rules, MFA devices, OAuth applications, just anything that could have been threat actor activity. If you don't need it in your environment, just remove it. It's better to have a clean environment when you are doing your day-to-day business operations. Additionally, to better protect yourself from M365 environments and just have a better idea of what's going on, as I mentioned earlier, try and enable stronger MFA methods in your M365 environment if you don't already have that. So again, that can include anything like FIDO2 authentication, even token-based authentication if FIDO2 doesn't work. I know a lot of our organizations, if they're smaller, definitely don't want to be using something like a physical authentication method, which we understand. But just anything that's a little bit stronger that would be harder for a threat actor to get access to would be great. One thing I do want to know about MFA methods, having MFA alone is not going to stop a threat actor from getting into an environment, and I think that's something that's really important to talk about. but it's better than having nothing. And I think that's why that's something that we really encourage our clients to have. I think a threat actor can probably figure out 15 different ways to bypass any kind of hardening method that we can come up with. They're always changing, they're always trying new things. But again, it's better to protect ourselves as much as we can. The next is to consider requiring admin approved device registration in your M365 environment. That'll ensure that threat actors won't be trying to add devices or try basically using their own infrastructure during their threat actor activity. Next is to conduct regular audits of your inbox rules and OAuth applications, also your delegate access. Again, you really want to try and have as much visibility as you can while you're looking over your M365 environment. So if you're either running into your own investigation or you're trying to have a third-party investigation, you can have as much information as you can so that you can try and conduct your investigation as fast as possible, because you want to resume back to business operations, I'm sure. Next is to consider regular security training. We see a lot of these attacks starting from phishing emails. We never want to blame our users, of course. I've seen some pretty convincing phishing emails myself. I always feel kind of bad when I see them. But conducting regular security trainings are also equally as important. You want to make sure that your users understand that they can have sensitive data. You don't want them to be susceptible to that loss. That's really important while we're talking about M365 investigations as well. Again, as I mentioned earlier, consider disabling legacy authentication. We want to make sure we're having as secure of an environment as possible, so that's definitely really important. Next, we didn't really talk about this too much, but you want to limit the number of recipients that are allowed to receive mails, if that makes sense for your business organization. I'm sure, again, there are reasons why one user might need to send out 100 or 150 users the same email. Definitely makes sense. But if your user doesn't need that, it's definitely good to disable, because oftentimes, and I know I'm sure you can speak to this as well, we see threat actors sending a singular phishing email to 150, 200 users. And it's a really quick way for them to try and further their phishing campaign and to try and get access to more data. So by limiting the number of recipients that can receive your those spam mails, it won't stop the attack for sure, but it'll definitely make it a little bit harder for threat actors to get their message out in a short amount of time. Finally, you're just going to want to limit the number of users with global admin access. Users should have access to only the areas that they need to have access to. That way, if there is an investigation, hopefully they're not infiltrating the actual admin account, but they're only, if they're in a user's mailbox, then they only have access to what that user needs to have access to. Nothing additional that would make the compromise even worse. So with that, we have some sources. We want to thank you for being such an attentive audience. Please follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Straws DFIR. Also check out our blog post, our organization post. Ida and I are actually in the process of writing one on OAuth applications. As I kind of mentioned earlier, we're doing some testing on that still, so we're kind of excited. So definitely check us out. And if anyone has any questions, let us know.
And we want to. And we also want to thank everyone at Straws for all the support, and besides for giving us this amazing opportunity to speak.
Happy to take any questions if you have any. Yeah.
Does the investigation change when there's an insider threat versus it's an external threat?
I wouldn't say it changes. I don't think we typically would see internal. I personally haven't seen internal threats within a business email compromise. I don't know if you have personally.
The process by which we investigate does not change, but of course there are several caveats and additions that we will make. Given any client, any investigation will have their own. The basics are always going to be the same, but you're going to add on as you go. Based on the client's needs, the client and counsel's requests.
And one thing with that too, if there is actually an internal threat, I think that's when conversations with the user would also be really critical,
Yes.
because then you would want to see what are they actually doing in their environment versus, I don't recognize this activity. This definitely wasn't me. So you can also have those conversations as well.
I guess the indicators of compromise would slightly change.
It would slightly change, especially if it's within the same organization, they're using similar devices. It might be a little bit more challenging to look at that. It's an interesting perspective. I actually haven't thought of that before.
It'd be easier to debate.
Debate
Defensive.
One thing I'm wondering though is that, I'm sure that activity also gets tracked, especially if they're maybe using a residential IP address. It might be easier, or leave the attacker a little bit more susceptible to making themselves known. So maybe they would be using those more anonymizing hosting providers as well. I'm not sure. That's actually.
User behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, yeah.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
if the user would legitimately confirm that they're using all the user agents, speaking with if it's an insider threat, speaking with the user would not necessarily be as,
I mean,
because the user would just defend their own actions.
yeah,
They're trying
it's
to
a
hide
little
their
bit hard
tracks,
when you're
but-
talking to users, especially because if these attacks are happening, a couple days ago, a couple
Yeah.
weeks ago, like realistically, how much are we going to remember of what we're clicking on every day, right? So you have to take that with a little bit of grain of salt, but it's still, I don't know, it's something to consider for sure.
Yeah, but we would still pull the same logs. We would still
we
look
would
at all
still
the
look-
same log sources.
It would be a very similar methodology, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
On like investigations, right? I feel like there's so many different rabbit holes to go down to.
Yes.
They upload stuff to your books.
Yes.
How do you like time box yourselves when you're building these sources to build that story?
So, I mean, I feel like we have our own workflows. Like, we've been doing
Yeah.
this for so long now that we kind of have an idea. Typically, what we would start with if, for example, our organization thinks that there's some kind of attack, but they don't fully know the full scope of how many users were involved, or, we can also identify users as we
Yeah.
go along as well. We typically start by doing a tenant triage. So we're getting basically an overview of what's going on in the M365 environment. From there, we start collecting for the users themselves. So that way, then we start you can start with mail items, you can start with
Yeah.
SharePoint, whatever you want to do at that point.
But if you're keeping track of IOCs and if you're timelining, it will be a little bit easier to keep track of your thoughts and keep track of what is bad versus what is good, in addition to regular communication with the client, counsel, user, whoever you're speaking to, your main point of contact.
Yeah.
Getting the logs and all that down to your computer and doing the analysis, what are some tools that you recommend to do the forensic analysis?
Yeah. So we're very fortunate. We work for an organization that has invested actually a lot of time into creating our own in-house tool, which is really great. You can download them specifically through Microsoft. I know there's some PowerShell commands or Microsoft Graph API as well. If you're interested in playing around with that. Again, the Unified Audit Log, we will always say this, is probably one of the most powerful tools.
Yeah.
I think that's in the security portal, I think. So if you wanted to play around with that, I think that's a really great place to start. You can kind of filter your timestamps if you have an idea of like when that attack happened. And you can pull it from there. There's a lot of data cleanup. I actually had to do it pretty recently.
It's in
Can confirm
JSON format.
it's in JSON format. It's a little bit messy, but you can definitely do it if you need to do it that way. Yeah.
Has Microsoft commented on what these random IPs are in their logs? Is there any documentation on that?
I actually, off the top of my head, I don't know.
No, I don't think there is.
I know our team
I don't
internally has tried to do some testing on it. I don't know. Definitely, if you find something, please let us know. It's a little annoying. Ooh, it's a little annoying. Yeah,
How often do you come across NFAs like this?
often.
Very often.
I would say probably like 50% of the time, if not maybe more.
Yeah.
I don't have the exact numbers, but it's pretty often.
Any interesting techniques identified?
Phishing, the Evil Engine X
Yeah.
phishing kit. We've got a really good blog
Yeah, we
post
actually have a
about
blog
that as
post
well.
about that too that recently got published. Highly recommend checking that one out. Yeah. Yeah.
The one struggle that I face is a lot of the users, don't remember clicking on it.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations on how to find that specific email?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's actually something I was working on
Yeah,
this
so-
week. So I think Ida mentioned the message trace log is a really great source. You can see what was sent, what was received. What we typically do is look at the first malicious activity and timeline a little bit backwards to see whether or not there's any emails that were a little bit suspicious. One thing I can think of, for example, is having an email that says your mailbox is full. That's something that's a little bit weird that could come, especially if you're looking at the email address that it's being sent from. You can look at email headers, which is another conversation I'm sure that could be had. But you can try and identify whether or not they got sent emails that were a little bit suspicious. Additionally, you can also pull out the mailbox itself, the PST file, and you can see whether or not it's still in the mailbox and try and recover that. Looks like we only have less than a minute.
If you're looking for a specific like phishing link, you could do host-based analysis and understand it, look at through the internet history to understand what links were clicked, and then correlate that with the phishing email or potential phishing email that you're going to find.
Yeah.
So just that
I think we're-
correlation is important too,
Yeah.
because the user may have clicked it unknowingly or accidentally even.
I think we're unfortunately out of time.
Okay.
We're out of time. Yeah. All right. Thank you, though.